Banking is in focus, and ahead of the union budget, we were in conversation with HDFC Bank, who tells ETNOW what the government needs to do, and that is to focus on the supply side constraints if it's to maintain growth at anywhere near the 8% level. Here's an exclusive conversation with Aditya Puri.
If we look going forward with a 7% growth rate at its effect on per capita, then the demand is going to increase substantially. So we already have supply side issues. Unless we address them in a very focused manner going forward, we all seem to take the 7% as a given. But unless we build up supply for the incremental demand as people move from below the poverty line to above, lower middle class to middle class and upper middle class, we have a problem. The fortunate part is I think most of them, and I have to say this like a commentator rather than a person on the ground, most of them can be solved, I wouldn't say easily, but with rational decision making. So if you look at the issue is power, we are short of power at this point, 13% at peak, could go up to 17, 18. But if we came out with a proper policy in terms of raw material, in terms of supply, in terms of pricing of power, I think the main issue, people wrongly focus that it's banking and finance. Banking and finance has nothing to do with it other than the fact that we are in the business of funding viable projects. So I think there's not a major problem that can't be fixed, but there are certain hard decisions that have to be taken. The same goes for subsidy, whether it is food, whether it is oil, whether it is transportation. These are all non-merit subsidies, and they are, even the government is acknowledging that it's not reaching the end beneficiary. But you need political capital to be able to take decisions on it.
Right, but we've talked about these challenges endlessly for years. What do you believe has held successive governments back from addressing these issues?
I think there are political connotations to all these issues. So if you say you're going to price power at the appropriate price, then somebody is going to tell you that the farmers' lobby is going to revolt, the middle class is going to revolt. So I think rationally we have answers to all of them. But this has largely been, I would say, two things, a conflict between politics and economics. And in that conflict, politics has been getting the upper hand. And once you start subsidizing, there is a finite amount of money that the government has to spend. So if it spends it on subsidy, it can't spend it here. And the other issue that happened is that we came up with this great concept of public-private partnership. Well, you also have to recognize that in a public-private partnership, you have to get viable pricing. And so the projects which originally used to come up in the public sector did not come up because you didn't change the end pricing.
Right now, not a lot of money is being put, or rather not enough money is being put in infrastructure development, both social and physical. Now, if you just look back to one example, the Kothari Commission report, which was put out more than 50 years back, or rather nearly 50 years back, they talked about spending something like 6% of GDP on education to support the number of people coming into the workforce every year. We're still today, 50 years later, spending less than half that amount on education. Would you put this down, and this is just one example, would you put it down to, the fact that non-discretionary spending by the government has been going up and getting out of hand, or would you just put this down to plain indifference on the part of successive governments?
I don't think it's indifference. Whoever you talk to, there is not a person, and I must say most of the people that you talk to, whether there's the politicians or the bureaucrats, recognize the need for it. So I wouldn't classify it as indifference. At the same time, the political compulsions, I think, have been, they've allowed them to go out of hand. And so continuously you have been spending on non-discretionary expenditure, which builds up no capital, which doesn't solve all these problems, and recognizing, and everybody knows, or at least now knows with greater emphasis, that you cannot fund two things through a fiscal deficit. You cannot fund growth, and you cannot fund poverty alleviation. I think people have realized that, and we have reached the limit. Till you don't have the limit, this is not peculiar to India. I think this has happened in the so-called advanced countries like Europe and everywhere else. As long as you have a situation where you have not stretched the limit to the end, you are quite likely to have politics prevail over economics. And so, to answer your question, I don't think it's indifference. I think it's just politics overpowering economics and rational thought.
All right, now, modernizing agriculture is one other area of addressing supply-side constraints. Within that, fragmented land holdings has been a hugely contentious issue. Do you believe the government can actually push ahead on that front fast enough, given the compulsion of regional politics?
Of course. I think that is not an issue. In the sense that even if you don't want to change the ownership structure, you can at least encourage cooperatives and the ability to make the cooperatives viable entities as a technical whole. So if you encourage, and that's a must, because with the fragmented holdings, they do not have the capacity to produce in a viable manner, and nor do they have the capacity to market it. But if you had, like you had the milk cooperative, take Amul, you have to have these things come in. I go to Nasik, one side, they're the big landlords, they have all the grapes, then next side it's lying fallow because it's fragmented holdings. And there are multiple laws. In fact, if you ask me, we talk about FDI in retail and 26% in insurance. That is, I frankly think is irrelevant. More important is, can we get our agricultural reforms right? Because that is where 50% of the population lives. And we have arable land second only to the US. So the opportunity to actually make a quantitative difference and stop giving these subsidies and giving them viable employment is to bring complete reform in agriculture. And that cannot be a political issue.
Right, now, assuming we sit tight and do nothing to address supply-side constraints, what's the best rate of growth we should expect?
Tough one. Firstly, I don't want to answer that, primarily because I'm an incurable optimist and I think this country has a future. And if I take you back, I don't think you can sit tight.
We've been sitting tight for so many years.
We've been sitting tight, but you know, you grow older as you go and death finally comes. So I think we've probably reached the limit of where we can sit tight. You can't. Just look around you, George. Whether it's the Maoists, whether you have people revolting against the law, whether you have people demanding their rights, I think the world has changed. I don't think they can sit right. But still, coming back on a hypothetical basis to your question, I think you can grow, but the automatic restraint will come mathematically. You'll grow, demand will exceed supply, you'll get inflation, you'll have to raise interest rates, you'll have to come back. So the point is, if we don't invest now, we probably already reached the limit of our 7% growth rate. Could continue for 1 or 2 years more if you're lucky. But beyond that, you're going to have major problems.